They like your report?
So we're going to get started. Hello to everyone joining us tonight, both in person and via the live stream. My name is Caroline Fusco, and I'm a professor here at the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education. The Brian Pronger Lectureship honors the late Professor Brian Pronger, distinguished critical scholar in philosophy of science, sport, and physical activity, and studies of gender, sexuality, and desire. Brian died peacefully on October 17, 2018, and an endowment for a lectureship was set up at his memorial service in the hope of inviting leading critical scholars to deliver lectures in the field that Brian cared deeply about. And that's why we can gather here tonight. So a little bit about Brian. Brian completed his PhD in philosophy and exercise science and was appointed a professor in the Faculty of the then Physical Education and Health by the Dean Bruce Kidd. Many people who are here and joining us via the live stream tonight have their own memories of Brian, and I would like you to think about those while I share a few of mine. I came to the University of Toronto to study with Brian because he was one of the top scholars in the field of physical cultural studies at that time, advancing postmodern, post-structuralist, queer, and social justice studies of the body, sexuality, desire, and science and technology. I arrived at the University of Toronto in September 1998, and right away Brian got to work on me. He had me audit an undergraduate class that was reading theorists such as Foucault, Haraway, Butler, Grosz, Schilling, Turner. These are all theorists of the body, fascism, normativity. He employed me as a TA for his ethics class where they were reading Heidegger, Alderman, Roos, who were theories of science and technology. And he advised me, of course, to take his graduate class, and there we were immersed in Bataille, Deleuze and Guattari, Drusilla Carnal, Jacques Derrida, Lyotard, Latour, Masumi. These are all theorists of desire, the postmodern, the limit, alterity, deconstruction, and transcendence. I was immersed in the kind of thinking that made my head spin, particularly because I'm from Belfast, Northern Ireland, and I hadn't met all these theorists before. It was a baptism of fire, and over the next 4.5 years, I was very fortunate to be in Brian's world. I spent time with him every week in classes where he worked out his theoretical directions for a seminal book, Body Fascism. I relished casual conversations in the hallways, although you never really had a casual conversation with Brian. I had epic car rides to conferences in the US and Canada. I was a guest at Brian and Jim's home and remember fondly their dogs, Yasha and Boris. And of course, no dissertation meeting with Brian would have been complete without one of his famous celebratory martinis. He was an incredible mentor and teacher, and I learned so much from him. I still have the course papers that I wrote for him with his handwritten comments and was mesmerized with Brian's notations in his books, the characteristic pencil-sketched round glasses beside what he deemed a very important point. And it's a practice I have continued. Brian fell ill in 2003, just before I defended my PhD dissertation. But since then, I've been dedicated to continuing his legacy of mentorship, teaching, and social justice. I was always saddened to think that whole generations of students would never experience what it was like to sit in a classroom with him and listen to his brilliant philosophies about the limits placed on the human body. But his words still survive in his writing and his books, and through them, students will have many opportunities to learn about ethics, resistance, and transcending domination, which Brian was committed to all his life through his work. Brian taught me long ago that, quote, seemingly innocuous, indeed well-intentioned systems do violence, both symbolically and materially to our bodies for living full lives. These words still guide me through all the anti-oppression work that I try to do. He encouraged me to always question and attempt to dismantle the limits of knowledge about the body, gender, sexuality, and to foreground justice, and to engage in the type of academic and activist practice that would, to quote him, foster a deep, indeed revolutionary freedom that would challenge the modern systems of sport. Through Brian, I developed a capacity to be more radical than I ever imagined, and he instilled in me to cite Toronto and Canadian poet novelist Dion Brand, quote, "a desire and a determination to live otherwise." So before we start, I would like to thank the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education's Dean Kerr, Gretchen Kerr, for providing financial and in-kind support to supplement the Brian Pronger Endowment Funds to host this lecture tonight, as well as Professor Dana Settler, who is the director of the Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies, of which Brian is a founding member, who are also contributing funds for hosting the event. I would like especially to thank Carol Lorraine, who is the executive assistant to the dean, for all her assistance in the setting up of tonight's event. I realized there was so much to do. And would like to give a special mention to the faculty's communication team, Sarah Baker and Makeda Mark Ali, for producing the lectureship poster, the e-advertising, the Eventbrite registration, and the photography, and the donation cards that you see on the desks. If you'd like to contribute to the endowment fund so future lectures like this one can continue, please take one of these cards for information. A thank you also to the faculty's facilities, the IT staff, as well as all those colleagues, departments, programs who helped spread the word about tonight's event. I also wanted to thank the Brian Pronger Lectureship Committee, who's composed of professors from Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education, Bruce Kidd and Margaret McNeil, Sexual Diversity Studies, Professor Scott Rader, Professor Moss Norman from the School of Kinesiology in UBC, and an alumnus, joining us, I hope, via the live stream tonight. Helen Kennedy, who is the Executive Director of EGAL Canada, Professor Dan Healy, who is here from Oxford University and who is also a longtime friend of Brian and Jim's, Jim Bartley, who is Brian's life partner, and Raya Timur, who is a FKPE graduating class of 2022, and I wanted to especially thank you for helping with the scheduling and working with me on things like the reception at the faculty club, which will be held after this event. And I call now on Raya to deliver a land acknowledgement.
I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. In making this acknowledgement, we have the opportunity to appreciate the unique role and relationship that each of us has with the land, and provides a gentle reminder of the broader perspectives that expand our understanding to encompass the long-standing, rich history of the land and our privileged role in residing here. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation.
Thank you, Raya. When the Brian Pronger Lectureship Committee talked about who might deliver the inaugural lecture, we could not think of anyone more fitting to speak tonight than our dear colleague and friend, Professor Geneviève Rail. Geneviève and Brian were longtime friends and queer disruptors of the sociology of sport and physical cultural studies, so it is with great pleasure that I introduce her to you tonight. Geneviève Rail received her PhD from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's taught courses related to women's bodies, physical activity, and health at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Health Sciences from 1991 to 2009. Since then, she's been the principal and then professor of feminist cultural studies of health at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute at Concordia University. Geneviève was named Distinguished Professor Emerita in 2020 and is currently pursuing her research on women's experiences of body-related institutions and her approaches are feminist, post-structuralist, decolonial, and queer. Author of over 100 articles and book chapters, she's been a keynote speaker in over 50 national and international conferences. And in the last 20 years, she has received funding from the Canadian and Australian Research Councils for a series of research projects involving women from various sexuality, race, ethnicity, ability, and socioeconomic milieux. She is interested in these women and how women discursively construct and embody their experiences of health. Her latest CIHR-funded project deals with fatness and fat phobia, HPV vaccination, and breast and gynecological cancer care for LGBTQ persons. And as well as delivering tonight's lecture, Professor Rail has also kindly agreed to give a graduate theory lecture class tomorrow to a small group of very lucky graduate students, which we're all excited about. But for now, please join me in welcoming Professor Geneviève Rail.
Thanks for the introduction, Caroline. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm humbled, very humbled, deeply honored to be here for this inaugural Brian Pronger Memorial Lecture. I see this occasion to celebrate Brian Pronger's life, his writings, his activism, and as an event also allowing all of us to honor his memory. I'd like to congratulate Jim Bartley and other members of the committee for this initiative, for giving their time to organize this event and hopefully many more after this one, if it's not a disaster. So thank you for making this happen. Also members of the committee, Caroline, of course, chair of the committee, Bruce Kidd, Margaret McNeil, Moss Norman, who's at the University of Manitoba. No, he's moved to UBC. Yeah. And colleagues, Scott Rater, Helen Kennedy, Rayat Thomier, and Dan Healy. Thank you for inviting me, for thinking of me, for giving me the opportunity, I guess, to reminisce, to think about Brian, to speak a little bit about Brian, some of his ideas, and how they connect with my own ideas. When I told my partner that I'd been invited to give this lecture, she was really curious to know what had informed this choice. We discussed this a little bit, Caroline and I, but I talked to Lily, and she was reminding me, after all, how Brian really wrote about gays in sport, and then about the technology of physical fitness, and then how he dared to talk about subjects that were and are still taboo, sexuality, homosexuality, desire, homoeroticism in sport. And so I'm sorry to disappoint some of you. I will not be speaking about sport or about gay porn or queer porn tonight. It could have been fun though, but I had something else in mind. But let's say that after discussing with my partner, I started to make connection and realized that despite our distinct backgrounds, Brian and I found each other at conferences. We discovered common interests in gender, sexuality, the body, French post-structuralists, of course, like you mentioned, Foucault and Lyotard, Derrida, and Deleuze and Guattari were big fan. Both of us were big fans of them. And we never wrote together, Brian and I, but Brian did have a chapter in a book that I published, and we both extended our critiques to science and biomedicine. So there were a number of connections there. Brian visited my place in Montreal a few times. We treasured evenings of classical music and nights of less classical activities. if I can put it this way. Brian and his dear partner Jim also welcomed me in their home for amazing evenings of carefully prepared meals and extremely stimulating conversations. So I'm grateful to both Brian and Jim for their warmth and for their trailblazing contributions in their respective fields. Brian was, as Caroline mentioned, the intellectual that I am not. He developed a post-structuralist, queer, and social justice vision of the body and desire. Interestingly, it's at the moment when mainstream discourses were discussing issues of the homosexual body as mainly the victimized body, the AIDS body. This was the times. But it is at that very time that Brian rather wrote and presented in conferences about sex, about desire, about transcendent power, and about gays in sports. When scientific approaches radically transformed physical education in Canada, Brian again was doing his own thing. He published his book, Body Fascism, a groundbreaking critique of science and the technology of physical fitness. Brian often quoted Deleuze and Guattari. These authors tell us that any literature that takes itself as an end transports the illiterate, and that the only literature that's really worth it is that which places an explosive device in its package and encourages us to experience joyfully the explosion of ideas in our head. This was Brian's literature for me. Let me try to navigate through this thing here to get to my own presentation. There we go. So as my title indicates, I will be speaking about so-called vulnerable bodies and the issue of knowledge. The title of my presentation is a way of paying tribute to Brian's work. Brian wrote, and I'm not sure if I can, wrote an early book about sport, masculinity, and homosexuality. The arena of masculinity. And some of his arguments were encapsulated in a later article entitled Out of My End Zone, Sport and the Territorial Anus. Brian had a way with words, as you can see. In this piece, Brian suggests that competitive sport is all about a desire to conquer or penetrate the space of the other, and to protect or close one's own space, thus out of my end zone. He deconstructs the logic of competitive sport and draws parallels by speaking of the phallus with its offensive strategy and desire to win, and the closed anus with its defensive strategy and the desire not to lose. In other words, he sees competitive sports as a celebration of patriarchal violation and homophobic resistance to penetration. Brian's critique of competitive sport goes further, as he argues that men should open up their bodies to the possibility of new forms of receptive desire, to the erotic event of being joyfully penetrated, as he sees this openness as a way to subvert mainstream masculinity, to deterritorialize men's bodies, and to literally open the gates to a desire that is feminist, anti-misogynistic, and freed from homophobic forms of masculinity. His is really an invitation to enter the end zone. And so I used this idea for my own title. Brian pursued these ideas and penned another thought-provoking article entitled, as you can see here, On Your Knees, Carnal Knowledge, Masculine Dissolution, Doing Feminism. I will not summarize it here, but suffice it to say that I love this title and the expression carnal knowledge. I'll come back to that. His use of this archaic euphemism for sexual penetration is cheeky. I guess that's why I like it, but I took the liberty of borrowing it as yet another way of connecting to Brian's writings, and I'll come back to this. Now on to my own research. So I'd like to speak about the field of cancer and the field of cancer care, but also how it surrounds lesbian, bisexual, trans, and queer folks. And so from here on, I will use the acronym LBTQ. And the idea is that LBTQ individuals are not well served by the existing knowledge on cancer. The disparity between subpopulations signals the urgency of improving access to what some call culturally relevant knowledges. And this is the topic of my presentation today. So first, I'd like to briefly address the issue of vulnerability, since LGBTQ people are often considered as a vulnerable subpopulation in the medical world. Then I explored the notion of vulnerability and how it informs the situation of LGBTQ individuals living with cancer. To do this, I present some of the results from our Cancer Margins project. And finally, I conclude on the need to rethink and queer cancer. The notion of vulnerability is fashionable. I see it everywhere. In sociology, psychology, public health, geography, disaster studies, criminology, environmental sciences, it's everywhere. Its sweeping use has been criticized, however, because the discourse on vulnerable groups generally reproduces a kind of paternalistic power. It links vulnerability to passivity, and it confers authority on regulatory organizations. Scholars have notably put forward a critique of institutions that victimize and do violence to women and sexually minoritized individuals. A colleague of mine, Naima Amrouni, who's a feminist philosopher, argues that the powerful put in place institutions and rules that favor them and that place all of us in conditions of vulnerability. For most theorists, vulnerability is seen as inherent to human life. We are vulnerable since we are exposed to others and to our environment. Many also note the contingent nature of vulnerability. Thus, certain individuals experience what we could say specific kinds of vulnerabilities. It is therefore possible to distinguish two main types of vulnerability: essential vulnerability, which refers to our human condition, and circumstantial vulnerability, which can be associated with a particular context, or which is present in social relations of gender, of sex, of race, of ethnicity, of class, of sexuality, and so on. These social relations being marked by oppression and inequality. Judith Butler comments on our current biopolitical situation where populations are increasingly subject to vulnerability. Butler speaks of these situations as produced by neoliberal institutions that make self-sufficiency a moral ideal, while destroying its conditions of possibility. Critical theorists such as Butler or Gayatri Spivak distinguish themselves by the importance they grant to the resistance and political action of the so-called vulnerable individuals. Strongly influenced by queer theories and post-colonial theories, they refute the idea according to which vulnerability requires a form of invasive state intervention or the identification of needs by so-called benevolent agents. They critique such interventions for their paternalistic and colonial overtones. And I must say history, how do you say this in English? History proves them right. If vulnerability is often associated with a state of passivity, this is an error according to them, since they see the capacity to act as inseparable from a condition of vulnerability. Indeed, vulnerability cannot be disentangled from agency. In typical scenarios, the vulnerable person is the disposable victim who can only be helped or rescued. Butlerian theory consists in queering this notion, queering vulnerability, and thus opposing the dominant discourses that construct so-called vulnerable subjects who must be saved. Butler observes that resistance emerges not only despite vulnerability, but precisely because of it. These reflections on vulnerability are particularly relevant to understanding emancipatory practices in the field of health, more specifically in the field of cancer care. So let me move on to speak a little bit about sexual and gender minorities and how they are often overlooked in cancer research. And so we'll speak about sexual minorities, cancer, and vulnerability. So if I very grossly, or if I do a caricature, I guess, of some of the existing literature that we have right now in cancer care, we can say that research on the health of gay men has been mainly driven by interest in HIV and contagion, while lesbian bodies have generally remained in indecipherable or reduced to stereotypes. As for trans and intersex bodies carrying cancer, they're most often held hostage in oncological treatment protocols located too close to diagnosis and too far from care. That's an important conclusion from the literature: too close to diagnosis and too far from care. In a few studies that specifically focus on LGBTQ people, results suggest that they're less likely to have a family or a regular doctor, to receive routine health care, or to participate in breast or gynecological cancer screening. They're also more likely to express dissatisfaction with healthcare professionals, and studies have documented the presence of homophobia, heterosexism, and cisgenderism in cancer care. Like all humans, sexual and gender minorities have certain vulnerabilities, but they seem to enter into healthcare institutions that are themselves vulnerable to racism, sexism, heterosexism, and cisgenderism. If Butlerian theory is right, the situation of subjects deemed vulnerable in a traditional sense of the term could, in fact, become a site for emancipatory practices. It could surface a constellation of not just vulnerability, but also resistance, rage, agency. The goal of the project I'm involved with was precisely to look into this issue, to contribute to current knowledge by empirically documenting what is going on with LGBTQ people who are living with breast or gynecological cancer. So let me now speak a little bit about our research on cancer's margins. First, I guess I need to acknowledge the contribution, the financial contribution of CIHR for this study. Now, the study is a collective effort involving colleagues from 5 different provinces and 5 different universities in Canada, with Mary Bryson as my dear friend Mary as a PI, Lorna Boschman also from UBC, Janice Ristock from the University of Manitoba, Tay Hart at Ryerson, and Jackie Gahagan from Dalhousie. So I'm acknowledging this at the same time that I take full responsibility for what I will present, because it's mostly based on the data collection that I did for the province of Quebec. So most of the examples come from Quebec. So with this Cancer Margins project, our approach is qualitative, subjective, and engaged. It lies at the intersection of theory and activism. While cancer studies usually focus on curing cancer, certainly you've heard of the term, find a cure, and always focusing on the cure when we talk about cancer. Here, exploring the dominant discourses on cancer and its care, questioning its foundations, co-constructing new knowledges, all of this is rather about queering cancer than curing cancer. So to do this, the project favors a post-structuralist and feminist approach involving conversations with participants recruited in 5 provinces. We used all sorts of methods to recruit participants, including postcards that we distributed in different venues. So this one's from Quebec, it's in French, but here you have an English language one. In the end, we were able to recruit 81 participants who varied in sexual and gender identity, race, ethnicity, disability, socioeconomic status, as well as the type of cancer and the cancer grade. Participants were asked directly if they identified as transgender or gender nonconforming, and 10 answered yes. Of the other 71, 31 identified as cisgender or women. The other 38 used a variety of non-normative identity terms to describe their gender. Kinky femme, gender queer, butch, etc. Which to me indicated a much more complex relationship to gender than what we hear in mainstream discourses. Participants range in age from 33 to 75, and all had been diagnosed with and treated for breast or gynecological cancer. The video recorded conversations lasted between 2 and 4 hours and allowed participants to talk about their cancer experiences. For this project, we were first interested in the field of cancer, how it surrounds the participants. We wanted to know the kinds of discourses present in a number of formal sectors where cancer knowledge is circulated. For instance, the academic and research sectors, governments, health institutions, NGOs, focusing on health or cancer. We've thus started our study with an exploration of these discourses. And our analysis reveals that biomedicine permeates cancer knowledge, and within it, a number of discourses have emerged. And for those who've read Body Fascism, which I will talk about tomorrow a bit more in detail, but you will see that a number of these discourses are very similar to what Brian has found when he looked at, of course, the field of biomedicine, but also the technology of physical fitness. So I'm not going to go into much detail here, but I will just identify some of these discourses that are that are there surrounding our participants who are navigating these complex discourses and trying to negotiate their cancer trajectory, you know, in a sea of mainstream discourses that you see here. So, of course, first the biomedical discourse with its trust in technology in modern medicine to advance the war. You know, the war metaphors are very present, the war on cancer. The discourse of self-management, or the rhetoric of self-care and responsibility that positions patients as active, autonomous, and supposedly empowered consumers of, who are enjoined to manage complex biomedical knowledges. The discourse of risk, when individuals are incited to put in place surveillance mechanisms to monitor themselves, to calculate the risks to which they are exposed, and to manage them. The DIY health discourse, so that's when individuals are encouraged to manage risk by means of accessing knowledge, also by means of self-surveillance, risk assessment, and prevention. The neoliberal discourse, which of course feeds the DIY health logic and conflates agency with consumption of health goods and services. The biopolitical discourse of inclusion and difference for sexual minorities. This discourse takes fixed categories of sexual identity as the foundation of a medical strategy and health promotion approach. For instance, when it assumes health risks based on stereotypes. And I guess one good example of this is the discourse of lesbian health, because of course we've all met this universal lesbian, sorry, who supposedly has this elevated risk because that person avoids screening, she has an elevated body mass index, she smokes, she consumes alcohol, she doesn't have kids, all of course associated with elevated levels of breast and gynecological cancer. So this really is a, what I would call a reification of the universal lesbian and its particular ascription of risk. And finally, the dominant discourse of cancer with its focus on modern medicine, cancer cure, detection, of course never primary prevention. That's a no-no because I guess the companies who are polluting our environments are the ones who are paying for breast cancer research, so we're not going to see it. We're not going to see primary prevention as part of that discourse. And that's also a discourse that includes heroic cancer stories, such as the one we hear with the pink ribbon campaigns, and the reconstruction of states of normalcy. That's an American picture, I should say. Although we do have these pretty silly events in Canada as well. And you know where the money is going. Okay. So my reading of these discourses leads me to critically interrogate their problematic stipulations and the deleterious impact they may have on LGBTQ individuals who construct themselves within such discourses. Furthermore, I find it crucial to juxtapose these discourses, to put them side by side with our participants' narratives, especially since these narratives surface a relation to cancer that's very rarely based on such dominant discourses. And so I will get into this with some of these stories. Oh, maybe I should stop here. So our analysis of the interview transcripts allowed us to observe a certain variation in the ways in which our participants react to dominant discourses that surround them. We found that these participants generally internalize a few discourses. For instance, the discourse of self-discipline and the discourse of self-responsibility for health. No doubt that there's a cultural logic of biographical obedience that is present in the narratives of our cancer patients. At the same time, though, we found that most participants resisted normalizing discourses. I'm not going to go through this in much detail, but you can see on the left the sort of the curing cancer stories that we hear mostly in the media, and on the right the elements that are part of our participants' narratives, which seem to be more about queering cancer. Despite a context heavy with constraints, our participants' stories reveal a relationship to cancer based not on accepting normalizing practices, but rather on queering them. For instance, biomedical and standardized narratives of cancer cure often include narratives of bodily norm and body reproduction, reproducing the normal body, as well as narratives of courage, determination, and survival in the face of cancer. In contrast, our participants' narratives are rather on the margins of cancer and cancer care. So this summarizes some of our results, and as a way to unpack this and introduce this also in a way, I'd like to show a short video clip that's meant to give you an idea of the kinds of stories, alternative stories that we heard from some of our participants. And this particular clip we used we used it it's coming from our pilot study, but we also used it towards the end of the study when we organized workshops with our participants, workshops to put together digital stories, so short video clips. And so I will show maybe one or two later. But first, let me get out of this and show you. I might need help here. I'm a Mac person. Okay.
It's not like anything prepares you for that moment.
It was like the worst 30 seconds I can imagine being waited for.
You have breast cancer.
It happened, and I started to cry, and then I asked them to leave the room.
I don't know what to say. I don't even know anything about what it is that I'm dealing with.
Then they came back, and they brought me this maxi pad that was the size of a child's diaper that I looked at, and I thought, that's hilarious because I'm wearing baggy boxers, and like I can't even put that in my pants.
I get the biopsy report, and I'm stunned.
It was deemed not to be cancer or pre-cancer.
I have what's known as grade 3 carcinoma.
It was unknown as to why the learning was specific.
It's a particular shape of cancer cell, carcinoma, which is strongly linked with recurrence and with mortality.
And so it was advised that we take things out speeding.
I have an appointment to go and see the oncology surgeon.
And then it was advised that I go and have an internal ultrasound.
From the moment that you have a diagnosis of breast cancer, you are making decisions about mastectomy.
Which required that I go to a women's diagnostic clinic in a building downtown.
I know that they're going to have this whole kind of either save the breast or reproduce the breast kind of emphasis, and that's just not going to be my issue.
It was me and a bunch of pregnant women in a waiting room that was purple and talking all about mammograms and baby. There was baby paraphernalia everywhere.
I've already decided I'm going to have a bilateral mastectomy.
I I engaged the surgeon in a conversation about the fact that I had to fill out all these forms that said Ms. Blank.
And it was, in some significant way, about improving my odds. But it was also because I was already making a story for myself.
I said, it wouldn't be that hard to change the forms.
I was already imagining how incredibly cool, how really amazing my profile would be in a men's shirt.
And she asked me what to do about changing the forms, and I said, just remove the salutation, just remove the title.
I'm already in both places. I am already really enjoying the fact that I'm going to be doing something in terms of my body that I'm going to be able to get a lot of pleasure out of. And I have breast cancer.
She came over and touched my arm and said, what are you? Are you a transgender?
Oh, and then she says, like an afterthought at the end of all this, and what about reconstruction?
To which I said, yes, I identify as trans.
I don't know how to get out of this. Sorry. I pressed escape, but nothing happened. Aha. Thank you so much. Okay. Okay, that's good. Anyway, so this short clip gives you an idea of the kind of stories we were collecting from our participants, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about these stories. Briefly, three kinds of stories that I'm sharing tonight. A first type, I guess, are stories of agency and reflexivity. Within these stories of resistance to usual healthcare protocols, we can observe an active reflexivity in the face of diversity. The participants appropriate discourses of resistance. People are considered autonomous, I guess is the word, but only when they govern themselves according to rational principles recognized by medical systems, medical institutions. The pressure to adopt standard practices is therefore enormous. Self-determination and the autonomy to act outside medical conventions are part of this queering of cancer. So two quick stories. The first is an excerpt from the conversation with Monica. Monica is a 67-year-old self-identified old-fashioned lesbian who had breast cancer, and she passed away recently. But between her first diagnosis and her passing, she had time to publish 4 books on lesbian eroticism, and so she was quite the fighter. So let me quote Monica here. These are, by the way, fictitious names and fictitious pictures. I quote, "I met the second oncologist at the first hospital. Him I didn't like at all. He was a young, very dynamic, management-like guy, and he had a plan. I could tell, okay, this is big pharma here talking. First he said, we do chemo because the lump is too big already to be operated on. You can't be operated. First chemo to shrink it, then operation, then we do radiation, then you do chemo a bit. And all of me just said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to follow your plan. Then I changed hospitals. Much later, at another hospital, they took the lump out. And then the surgeon told me, okay, 14 lymph nodes and 4 are cancerous. and you need to do chemotherapy. That was already difficult enough to take. And then he sent me on to research. So I met 2 young women technicians who wanted me to consent to a research program, some research in chemotherapy, a new drug of some sort. And there I became quite upset, really. And I said, no, I'm going to think about it and I'll let you know, but I don't think I'm going to do that. So finally one morning I woke up and I said, okay, I'm going to do chemo, and that's it. I can't explain why. I can't explain right now how it happened. In 2006, it had moved to the lungs. The doctor wanted to operate my lung. She wanted a biopsy. She wanted to do this and that. And there I said, I said, I'm going to write a book. I'm writing a book, and I'm not going to do any of this. So far, so good. This was 9 years after that event. So she said, I'm writing a book and I'm not going to do any of this. So far, so good. Of course, I would like to get rid of the cancer, and I still would like to stop it. But the healing is not getting rid of the cancer. It's healing something completely different. And that's working anyway, whether the cancer is there or not. And I have to say that the cancer brought me there. The cancer is a symptom of something else. And I can tell I'm healing this something. End of quote. Another illustration of this type of story is offered through the interview with Ariel, a 50-year-old genderqueer Latinx living with breast cancer. Ariel recounted telling healthcare staff that their decision to have a bilateral mastectomy was informed by their experience of seeing other members of their community undergo mastectomy in the context of gender-affirming care. So I quote Ariel here. So he started with, we could do a lumpectomy and blah, blah, blah. I think even the first night, I'd already decided I wanted a bilateral mastectomy. It was really immediate and strong for me. So I said that. And he's like, why would you do that? And I'm like, there's a lot of women in my community who are transitioning, you know, having top surgery. I don't see this as a bad option. You could just see his little mind pedaling as fast as it could to try to keep up with what my partner and I were talking about. Because he had no friggin' idea. I think we really unnerved him. Then we went to go see another surgeon, but it was the same thing. End of quote. The LGBTQ participants consider their gender expression, but they're also considering their parenting plans, their parenting responsibilities, their sexuality, and other aspects of their intersectional identity in their cancer treatment decision-making process. Most participants offered stories of significant difficulties in communicating with healthcare providers who made little effort to understand or accept their decision, especially when they contravened normative bodily or medical conventions or expectations. Despite their situation of vulnerability in the face of experts, one can feel the participants' resistance to a predefined trajectory, as well as their agency in the visioning of an alternative action plan. As Butler would say, the objective of their resistance is to fight against a mode of unviability and to signal the need for a livable life. On to stories of cancer and body failure. In this second type of story, we find narratives that you will not hear about in mainstream media. These are stories that are never seen, never heard. Indeed, in the media, we're fed cancer stories of bravery, of superhuman survival, the type of stories worthy of the pink ribbon industry. But joyful stories of victory over cancer are at times far removed from the daily lives of our LGBTQ participants. These participants rather shared more complex stories of, at times, crumbling subjectivity, pain, difficulties, humiliation, shame, self-censorship, invisibility, and loneliness. Here, as an example, is a story. Actually, it's a composite story because this is one of my interviews, but I had this conversation with, we'll call her Claire, 68-year-old retired teacher who identifies as Two-Spirit. And Claire, so we had, I think it lasted, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours. It was a very long conversation. And what I did is I took bits and pieces of that conversation to have this composite stories, just to try to convey to you what our exchange was all about. So I quote here, these are all real words that Claire mentioned. The treatment I received 9 years ago for my ovarian cancer did not work. After the treatment, they tried a second treatment, but then they burnt me. My mouth, my hands, all burnt. Then they tried another treatment that was more or less successful. My companion, it was hell for her too, with her throat cancer. I can understand that she became aggressive after her surgery. First, she was in pain, but I'm sure that she was still drinking. She was an alcoholic, you know. And she could not speak. She was frustrated. She was mean. I visited her for 3 months at the hospital. She was well treated. But you know, at the hospital, sexual orientation, they don't talk about. Sometimes they spoke of being a cancer survivor, but there aren't that many cancer survivors, because at one point it catches up to you. My companion has died, and as for me, my cancer has come back and I have refused treatment. This morning I went to see my doctor and she told me, you know, death, that's normal. But at 8:30 in the morning, you are not in the mood to hear that. So I started to cry for a bit. And then she told me right away, do you want to see a therapist? I told her, I'll be fine. In terms of sexuality, I did not speak about it with my parents. My mother was absolutely not open to that. No, I never spoke to her about that. It just could not happen. But my father, it could have happened. He told my sister, I know she prefers women. He said, a life alone, that's hard. Well, it's true that we are alone. With my companion, it did not work out. Finally, we each slept in our own room, and it was like that for 16 years, except after the surgery, she left and got her own apartment, and after that, she left for the hospital and she died. I had another friend that I kept on seeing. I had known her for 30 years. She never accepted that I had a companion. She confided that she too loved me. She was a pretty exceptional person. We saw each other more after my companion died. But this friend, she also died. We had just celebrated her 65th anniversary. A woman in good shape. But you know, she died from an aneurysm. I went to see my doctor afterward, and my cholesterol is good. I don't have high blood pressure. I have nothing. So she told me, these are all good news. And then I went back to my car and I said, I don't want to live anymore. End of quote. So in the case of Claire, we feel the self-effacement of a person of a certain generation. We also feel her institutional erasure. It is not uncommon for those belonging to a sexual minority to remain in a closet for fear of stigma and discrimination. In fact, a relentless element of cancer care for our LGBTQ participants was the perception of a high level of risk associated with coming out of the closet, particularly in oncology settings. When they happened, disclosures were fraught events that often resulted in truncated communication with healthcare providers, especially those who were short on knowledge regarding LGBTQ individuals and cancer issues. Negative interactions typically resulted in strategic practices of self-censorship, and this phenomenon was even more present for racialized and disabled participants. In view of this, one might think that Claire and other patients are vulnerable in the traditional sense of the term. But if these individuals are presumed to be weak, they are tenacious in the face of illness. For instance, Claire's silence before the nursing staff, her refusal to divulge her pain, her distress, her desire not to live any longer and to join her loved one in death, could be qualified as agentic silence. I'm using here Wendy Brown's concept. While speaking up has often been associated with agency, silence has primarily been associated with obedience and oppression. However, Brown maintains that silence and speaking out are not always clearly opposed and can in fact both constitute discursive practices. Silence can be part of a logic of action and can even be an act of resistance. It can be used to shield individuals from dominant monocultural knowledge with which they do not agree. Here, Claire's agentic silence also protects her from stigma and allows her to counter the doctor's expectations and to grieve in private. The last stories I'd like to speak about are stories of cancer as a site of resistance, but also as a site of biographical repair. While Canadian healthcare systems pride themselves on using evidence-based medicine, this type of medicine is characterized by the reproduction of bodily norms. Evidence-based practices are situated within clinical discourses that seem to be in permanent opposition to the deeply affective and existential narratives of our participants. In contrast to such normative discourses, we found narratives in which sex, gender, and sexuality are non-binary and complex, narratives that blur norms surrounding cancer care. The following video clip authored by Mark, so Mark took part in the workshops we organized at the end with a number of our participants who were asked to author, I guess, their digital story. So again, I'm going to try to do this. Lou, okay.
Il y a eu 3 blessures. J'ai eu des problèmes d'automutilation. C'est moi qui me donnais mes propres cicatrices. C'est là que ça a commencé, les premières blessures. Le cancer, ça a été comme une blessure imposée. Je dirais que la transition, c'est une blessure guérissante. Après la chirurgie, j'avais une cicatrice sur mon sein, puis c'était très lourd. Il y avait tout le phénomène de la féminité qui était concerné. Le mot « lourd », je le trouve ordinaire dans la langue française, mais c'est juste celui-là qui me vient à chaque fois. La lourdeur. La lourdeur fait référence à la féminité. Il y a toujours ce lien-là pour moi qui est très fort. J'aurais eu le cancer ailleurs que dans le sein, je suis pas sûr que ça aurait eu le même impact. Mais il n'y a pas juste eu de la lourdeur. À travers tout ça, il y a eu des moments très lourds, mais il y a eu des moments très beaux aussi. L'allaitement, pour moi, ça a été des moments extraordinaires. De donner la vie à un enfant, Et en plus d'allaiter, pour moi, c'était la continuité de la vie. De voir la tête de l'enfant près du sein, c'était un moment magique, un moment où je me suis sentie très, très, très femme. J'aurais été triste de ne pas avoir vécu cette partie-là de ma vie. Dans la partie traitement, on n'a plus de vie familiale. Nos enfants n'existent plus. Nos relations amoureuses n'existent plus. On est juste là comme patient. Puis, on ne pense plus. Je pense qu'on met notre esprit à off. On nous dit, tu fais telle chose, puis on le fait. Après 2008, ma conjointe et moi, on a eu beaucoup de difficultés à être en relation. En 2010, j'ai dit, j'ai besoin de sortir de la maison. J'ai besoin de me retrouver dans un lieu neutre. Me retrouver. Ça, c'était criant. Je ne me retrouvais plus. Le cancer, c'est comme s'il est parti avec une partie importante de moi, qui était pivot jusque-là. Et là, je ne l'avais plus. J'avais complètement perdu mes repères. J'avais plus de genre. J'étais pas une femme. J'étais pas plus un homme. C'est quoi mes désirs? C'est quoi mes goûts? On dirait que j'avais tout perdu ça. En 2013, le trou que j'avais dans le sein, la cicatrice, je me vois me regarder dans le miroir, bouger les bras, et en bougeant, le trou devient encore plus colle dans le fond, juste pour me rappeler qu'il est bien là. Là, je suis plus capable de le voir, plus capable de le sentir. Je trouve l'image affreuse. Je suis plus capable de vivre avec. Je suis même allé m'acheter une prothèse pour mettre dans le soutien-gorge. Et à ce moment-là, qu'on m'a glissé un mot sur la reconstruction de ma mère. Je suis allé voir le chirurgien. J'ai assez de dégâts. Il a accepté de signer pour la reconstruction de ma mère. Et là, j'étais donc contente. Parce que j'allais avoir un sein, la même chose que l'autre côté. Mais je ne l'ai jamais vu, ce foutu chirurgien-là. Parce que quand ils m'ont rappelé pour me donner la date de la chirurgie, la panique m'a pris. J'en voulais plus. Je me suis dit, ça y est, je perds la boussole. Là, je venais de tomber dans un autre trou. Je venais de tomber dans un autre gouffre. Une transformation totale, irréversible, de l'âme, du corps et de l'esprit. On ne peut que grandir ou en mourir, et là s'installe doucement l'imprévisible.
So this video clip informs us of the ways in which certain cancer surgeries pose decision-making challenges as they involve significant risk, in the case here, significant gender disruption. Our participants' accounts of their interactions with their cancer surgeons give a good idea of the incommensurability of discourses and knowledges on cancer. As you can see on the slide here, biomedical knowledges on the one hand, opposed in contradiction, sometimes in opposition to biographical types of knowledges. And of course, difficult decisions to make all along the cancer trajectory, navigating these two contrasted types of knowledge. For those who participated in our study, surgery was a key event in the cancer trajectory, and we observed a variety of decisions, actually a very wide variety of decisions. For example, a few breast cancer patients opted for breast reconstruction following surgery, while the vast majority resisted that very pervasive discourse of the importance of reconstruction for a normal body and a supposedly normal life. These participants rather came to terms with the idea of a flat chest that disrupts norms surrounding sex, gender, and beauty ideals. Some participants have resisted the idea of prophylactic mastectomy, while others have insisted on having it even when this was not agreed by the healthcare providers. Finally, most transgender and gender nonconforming patients reported negative experiences. The binary deployment of gender in cancer institutions structures their invisibility, which sometimes led to various forms of delaying and even of denial of care. Notably, cancer care was seldom coordinated with gender-affirming care. Nevertheless, cancer became an important site of resistance and struggle. For many patients, emancipation emerged out of troubled trajectories, and in the end, the impact of surgery on gender identity and expression was perceived as positive. A very quick quote to see here from the conversation with Blake, a 57-year-old trans male from BC. So Blake had already been scheduled for top surgery when he was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And here is how he reacted. I quote here, "I saw the oncology surgeon on February 9. She said, 'We're going to do a hysterectomy. There's a chance that it will be cancer, but there's a chance that it'll just be cysts. It's a complex mass.' So I said, 'This is good news. I wanted a hysterectomy anyway. Works for me.' To me, it was all positive. So in that sense, although I was told there's a possibility of cancer here, that's not what I heard. What I heard was, I get a free hysterectomy." End quote. Typically, the patient's agency was manifested as they actively participated in decisions and deployed queer narratives to make sense of their treatment and help them repair biographical disruptions. For instance, Blake's surgery could be interpreted as restorative in the sense of reconciling physicality and gender identity. In the end, paying attention to intersectional specificities in cancer patient narratives has allowed us to identify several distinct biographical modes of self-knowledge that play a major role in how LGBTQ patients experience and resist biomedical scripts presented to them by cancer care providers across a highly choreographed cancer treatment trajectory. In general, we found that surgery impacted gender expression, but that care providers underestimated the link between cancer and gender. Our action research included an activist component that I talked about a little bit before when I spoke about workshops. So that component aimed through artistic practices to contribute to subjugated knowledges in the field of cancer. So we organized workshops with a subgroup of participants in various provinces. These people were put in tandem with a feminist videographer, and they worked for 3 days to create a micro-documentary lasting 4 to 5 minutes. Participants were asked to consider the story they wanted to share, and were invited to come to the workshop with photographs, videos, objects that they like, music that they like, any other material really that could help them in the creation of their digital story. At the end of the workshop, narrative frameworks were developed, and voices, music, and images were recorded. And we worked with videographers for the post-production once all that had been done. The digital stories are currently available, and we hope serve to queer relevant knowledge for LGBTQ people living with cancer. So this is the website, but for those who are interested, I'll give you the, anyway, so, you know, if you go to this, you can see maybe more stories.
I had no idea when I had my ovaries removed through a full hysterectomy at age 44 because my left one had stage 1 ovarian cancer growth.
So there's different stories to deal with different issues. In these video clips, we can sense the potential of feminist and queer politics. Our participants' cancer narratives are quest narratives, a search for alternatives, a quest for ways of living with cancer that include queer political action, and the co-construction of new and queer ways to think about the body and cancer. Let me just go back to this. Such queer artivism practices also aim to inform 2S LGBTQI communities of these realities and to equip some of us for continuing medical education sessions with healthcare providers. So all of us in our respective province have started that. I've already done a number of those sessions in Quebec. And through these activities, it is cancer itself that we hope to queer. I know there's just a few more words between me and the infamous martini, so thank you for your patience. I'll come to my conclusion right away. So I believe that in terms of cancer, knowledge should be expanded to consider the complexities raised by LGBTQ people and their queer narratives. Their stories enjoin us to deconstruct dominant biomedical discourses and to consider subjugated and culturally relevant knowledges. This new vision of cancer must take into account stories that upset the norms that prevail in cancer care institutions, that is, stories of vulnerability, yes, but also agency, rage, resistance, in short, stories on the margins of cancer. I agree with Butler that decreasing vulnerability is good, but that this approach does not capture the complexity of the problem or does not sufficiently counter structural forms of violence. For instance, one can wonder if once the quote-unquote vulnerable are constituted as such, power vanishes from their situation and simply resurfaces in the form of more paternalistic care. We have seen this in recent decades as a new language has gained ascendancy, where inequality is sometimes articulated as exclusion, domination is transformed into misfortune, injustice is replaced by suffering, and violence is expressed in terms of trauma. In this new lexicon, it is difficult to discern the sinister paradox of neoliberal biopolitics, namely how social institutions, even with the best of intentions, rely on and often duplicate relations of inequality and oppression. This is the case for biomedicine. I suggest that what we need here is to name and counter forms of sexist, heterosexist, or cisgenderist practices without producing a class of victims. And this signals the importance of opening up the most important field of knowledge surrounding cancer. Let me briefly come back to what Brian Pronger has written. Competitive sport demands a libidinal economy and emotional formation that is embedded in the masculine colonizing will to conquer the space of an other, while simultaneously protectively enclosing the space of the self in an attempt to establish even greater, ever greater sovereignty of self and consequent otherness of the other. This construction of desire is not unique to competitive sport. It is common to most masculine business, academic, and sexual practices. I will speak a bit more about this tomorrow, but in his book, Body Fascism, Brian extended his critique to biomedical science, which he felt should be more open to the infiltration of other kinds of knowledges. I think he was bang on. Using Brian's euphemism of carnal knowledge, I'd like to surface the need for a kind of sexual penetration into the biomedical field in the sense of loosening, de-tightening the field, allowing the penetration of sex, gender, sexualities, queer practices, queer knowledges into the patriarchal and heterosexual fields of oncology and biomedicine. It is in that sense that carnal or subjugated knowledges make queer cancer knowledge. But this is a daunting project. Oncological knowledge was largely developed at a time when LGBTQ individuals whose lives were discussed were not in the room. It was much easier. Because it was much safer to repeat cliches in medical milieus before queer, trans, and non-binary people had the audacity to raise their hand and to see themselves as knowledge-producing subjects. It was so much easier when experts needed not to fear the penetration of the wall of biomedical incomprehension surrounding sexual minorities living with cancer. Our study has shown how those who consider themselves as the guardians of real science are not so enthusiastic about the micro losses of control in the face of those with whom they often disidentify. But I believe our project advances the struggle as it acknowledges LGBTQ individuals and their solidarity, their networks, their analyses, their construction of necessary and relevant knowledges. Such knowledges confirm the inseparability of vulnerability from different forms of resistance. First, a resistance embodied via the very existence of cancerous LGBTQ bodies, bodies that resist the erasure, even the disappearance, of bodies exposed to the violence of cancer and that of standardized care, bodies that persist in conditions where their very capacity to persist is systematically undermined. Second, a performative resistance that is expressed in the refusal of biomedical norms and the regulation of bodies, instead affirming its presence in queer modes of existence. Finally, the resistance of bodies that may disappear but come alive again in the stories of their disappearance. Veritable odes to the interdependence of bodies, to the living processes to which they are part, to the support networks to which they contribute, to the relevant knowledge they create. These bodies, and I should add here, not unlike that of Brian, tell us, I will not disappear so easily, or my disappearance you can read it. Thank you. so much. Sure. Sorry for, it's been a long time, but it's, you know, emotions surface and that's that.
I'm going to let Geneviève field her own questions if anyone has any.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm very interested in the results of your research. I've read some of it as well that found this deep disconnect between gender-affirming care and oncological care. In my research, looking at non-binary standards of medical care through medical and medical intervention, I found a significant level of overlap between, of course, care from a pharmaceutical aspect and a significant improvement that could be found on gender-affirming medical care, say for taking testosterone, taking also Lupron or an aromatase inhibitor would actually reduce the incidence of gynecological and breast cancers if you map them together. I'm wondering, did you find anything in that particular mapping that is perhaps an in-way to interacting with continuing medical education courses that might push or force with already dominant narratives of statistical analysis?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very, very good point. I have to perhaps, obviously, you know, this was a research long in the making and long to make, and we still are interpreting results from this study, and so of course I'm trying to summarize it for you, you know, in only so many minutes. And so obviously there were healthcare providers in some areas that were fantastic and that were facing very difficult circumstances. And so my presentation caricatures a little bit healthcare providers as the nasty people in this story. And I guess for many participants, that was the case. So that's my little parenthesis, if you will. But there's no doubt that in the number of cities where these interviews occurred and where we had some of the participants, there were huge differences between levels and types of care. Obviously, if you're in Toronto, it's not the same thing as if you're in Winnipeg. And despite the so-called, you know, best practices and whatnot, most doctors are not really interested in them. And doctors, particularly oncology surgeons, are very close to the knowledge from their own areas, and they feel that trans, gender non-conforming individuals, and even sometimes even non-binary people are not their specialty, and they feel totally useless. And so although there's a significant overlap, as you mentioned, between kinds of treatments that could happen and that should happen because it would be so much easier for patients if the care was coordinated, it just didn't happen. And so there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done on that topic for sure. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this really, really compelling presentation, this lecture, and I want to just pay tribute to your informants, the people you interviewed, because they shared these really, really painful stories with you and made it possible for you to convey that to us. Mm-hmm. My question is really riffing a little bit off of this question earlier and thinking about oncology as a particular set of practices, a form of salvation through technology. It's a very blunt set of practices. It's a very imperfect set of practices. And I'm wondering if that's, if that is something that you've reflected on in the research design, in thinking about which kinds of therapies, which kinds of medicines, which branches of biomedicine you're going to look at.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure if I understand your point correctly, but there's no doubt that what the participants shared with us was their difficulty in being themselves in oncology settings, but more generally in health institutions. And that sounds like a very innocuous and not very important issue for most healthcare provider, as often they don't see what's that got to do with anything. And so what a number of the participants mentioned to us was really the difficulty in communicating between the patient and the doctor. And in the best case scenario, this communication is vital to coming together with the proper information to the correct decision. And all along the cancer trajectory, there are so many decisions to be made. So in the best case scenario, patients would be provided with the kinds of knowledges that would help them come to terms with certain difficult decisions. And these decisions would be the best for them. When there's this sort of incomprehension between doctors and patients, when there's homophobia, when there's little things, I mean, again, it sounds very innocuous, but I had this woman who was saying, I was with the doctor, and when I get out, I go to see my partner, and there's all these men who are waiting for their wives who have seen the doctor for breast cancer, for instance, and the nurse is going in the room and is talking to these guys and trying to make them understand some of the issues, and is trying to make them feel more comfortable, and sometimes is small talking to them, asking them if they have children and so on, just so that they can relax a little bit and perhaps better understand what they are conveying. And then, there's this one woman, one lesbian in the room who's waiting for her partner, who's with the doctor, and the nurses just have no clue how to interact with this person. They feel they don't have anything to tell her. They don't know what to tell her. They don't know how to act to make that person feel at ease. And it sounds so, I mean, we're in 2022. It sounds so ridiculous. But in some parts of Canada, that's a very, very clear reality. And so here we are navigating very complex knowledges, but having very little connection with the healthcare provider who's supposed to help. And the healthcare providers, I mean, as I said, there's a few that are fantastic, but there's a whole number who have no clue. They just they do their job, and that's how it's supposed to be done, and that's what they do. And if you ever suggest something else, they're just like, where's that coming from? Like they just so it makes for a very difficult journey because of this constant negotiation and trying to gather the relevant knowledge but not accessing it. And so it's a very long rambling answer, and maybe I didn't answer your question, but anyways, that's what I found. Yes.
Thank you for the. Could you share that website so we could watch the videos?
Yes.
Please.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll give it to Caroline. And
Thank you.
sure. Yeah, they're very interesting stories. all very different. And I guess that's also the whole point. And so I see this as relevant not just for LGBTQ individual, but for gay men as well, and for straight women, and for all sorts of people, that, you know, there should be a way to access culturally relevant knowledge, and to be able to not just be bulldozed by some pre-decided course of action. You should be able to discuss these issues and to be you know, an agent, to be a subject that can take your own decisions. And medicine always says that it's doing it, but it, you know, that's not always true. Yes.
For presentation, I was wondering if in your data collection, the types of questions you were asking and maybe the way the conversations were happening, was the participants' experiences always in relation to their interaction with the healthcare provider, or are there some comments related more generally to societal norms? And you brought up the sort of pink ribbon campaign and how these sort of norms and the stories having to sort of have this sort of resistance to these stories. I was wondering if in the data collection, yeah, these stories were coming out related to just the healthcare professional interaction, or
yeah, it was a little bit larger than this, indeed. We did have a number of questions. I mean, obviously, the interview mostly focused around their cancer trajectory, and so cancer decision-making processes and whatnot. But in order to do this, you know, all spoke about the knowledge that they could access to make these relevant decisions. And so that's why at the beginning I talked about what are the sort of discourses that are circulating. So for that we asked them, where do you take your information? Where do you go? And indeed they confided that they went to all sorts of, you know, the regular websites on breast cancer and Cancer Canada and all of the, you know, the usual cancer sites and whatnot, but that it did not speak to them. It did not speak to their own experience. And yeah, so as part of our team, Mary Bryson and who was it? Taylor. I don't remember her first name now, but two of our team members did write a piece specifically on where are they getting their information, what do they think about these places. And it's very interesting because we saw also in the study very generational types of differences. So for instance, the older individuals did go to the internet, but were not as good, let's say, or not as proficient at finding alternative types of information. And that reflected also some of their cancer choices around surgery, for instance. Whereas for younger patients, they seem much closer to queer, non-binary types of communities and the knowledges that are circulating there. And we're very proficient in finding alternative information on the internet. Often American sites, but nevertheless, you know, some sites with information. California has very good sites on these issues, for instance, and so they managed to find them. Yeah, we had older women who said, well, I'm a feminist, and for me what's important is to talk to other feminists in my community. And there, you know, about breast cancer, instead of having one how do you say that in English? One opinion on a particular surgery, for instance, or particular treatment. I had 12 because 12 women in my community had gone through breast cancer, and so I trusted them much better than I trusted any website. And so there were interesting differences there according to generations. Yeah.
I'll take one question.
Yes.
I was really struck by the idea of what felt like a biographical recovery process. And I wondered if you could tell us anything more about that experience of the video making, that practice, and beyond the products that we see, how that process may have played out and what you came to understand from that.
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. And indeed, I think in the, for some of the participants, the cancer experience, the cancer trajectory was painful and shameful. Anyways, there was not much negative to say about it, except perhaps for the kind of activism that they could have because of communicating with other groups, either via blogs or the internet, email, or just in their communities. But yes, for a number of individuals, it seemed that the whole process was not just negative. I mean, it's cancer, so it's, there's nothing fun about it, but they could find some very important elements that were positive and that brought them somewhere else in a number of different ways. Actually, I think 2 videos showed this to a certain extent with Mary and with Lou. And so, yeah, in some cases, the cancer experience was such that it allowed for a kind of restorative element. And even in the case of Monica, the author who went through cancer, and she felt like suddenly she could write, and she wrote these, and unfortunately she's an immigrant from Germany, and so most of her books were actually in German, but they are very well known in Germany. Well, probably because she's a famous author too. She was, and I'm allowed to say that because I got permission from her partner, but she's the founder of the Brot und Roses, Bread and Roses, the feminist marches in the 70s and whatnot. Anyway, so even for her, the cancer did something to her, not just physically, but for her whole being. So it's a different way, I guess, of living with cancer and not only seeing the negative of it. And the workshops, they were beautiful. I mean, it's not because it's my study or our study, I should say, but I participated only to the workshops in Montreal. Was not there for workshops in other provinces, but I know that we had a script and it was fairly similar and whatnot, but beautiful experiences of women who didn't know each other, who suddenly were put in the same room, and it was 3 days, so we all had meals together and we all worked together to comment on the work of everyone as we advanced in the project and whatnot. And yeah, I think it's part of being in the community, feeling like you're doing something. And I guess it reflects a little bit on the last sentences there. It's just like, I want to have been there, and I want for people to know that I've been there, and maybe to get something from my life. And so, obviously, very, very powerful moments that were lived there. Yes.
I was just thinking what you were saying about neoliberal discourses and this power of positive thinking and a lot of the trend and move to that. But what relationship does that have to this kind of making process or community building or an art practice that there's another study there, is what I'm saying.
For sure. I think the short video clips in and of themselves could be primary data. I don't like that term, but let's say qualitative materials to be studied for what is it that they wanted to share. And interestingly, all had some were, as like naked and right front and center. Others, it's a pair of boots that's talking and that's telling the story. Others, you don't see faces, it's just drawings. Others, so there's all sorts of, it's very, very creative, but everyone had a very different idea of the kind of story they wanted to tell. And obviously it speaks also to how we're all unique and we all have our own ways of digesting this cancer story and making sense of ourselves out of that. And so, my sense is that, there's a zillion different ways of going through the experience, and perhaps the study is a testament to that. And it's a lesson, I guess, for healthcare providers that they need to be not just talking, but they need to be listening, because what people make of their experience is so important, not just for their physical recovery and all of that, but for the kind of steps that they will be taking and the kind of lives that they will be living afterwards. And so, or the kinds of deaths that they will be having, but as some say, that's part of life too. So, Thank you very much.
Well, I want to give a very special thanks to our guest speaker, Professor Geneviève Rail. I think you're honoring and connections to Brian's work were incredibly important and very, for many of us who knew him and worked with him, very heartfelt for us, and I think demonstrate that his work nor your work will disappear easily. So thank you very much, Geneviève. And thank you all for attending this very special event tonight to honor Professor Brian Pronger. And we do look forward to seeing you at future lecture events in his name. And what I would like to do is call on Professor Mark Neal to give a small gift of gratitude to Geneviève for her wonderful lecture tonight. So for those of you who can join us, please make your way to the faculty club. It's at 40 Wilcox Street, which is 2 blocks south of this building between Huron Street and Spadina, for a small reception and some drinks, which I'm sure Brian would approve of. And I wanted to say good evening to everyone and please stay safe. Thank you.
I wanted to show this, because you were talking about this, and I had my last little slide.
Ah, there you go.